Hi everyone. Russian economy has survived the impact of sanctions and seems it is stable. Yes, it is stable, but it is not efficient. When Vladimir Putin came to power back in May 2012 to Kremlin, since then the average growth rate is about 1% per year. So for the country, for the developing country, it's not a lot. And that is the result, that is anti-efficiency of Putin's economic policy. Nevertheless, Russian economy is stable because Russia is the major exporter of global commodities, of palladium, potash fertilizers, oil, nickel, aluminum, copper, and so on and so far. So you see the share of Russia in global production and in global trade. Nevertheless, Russian economy faces challenges: short run, medium run, and long run. Short run is within 1 year. Budget? No. Global output, GDP decline? No. Unemployment? Definitely not. Inflation? Yes. Inflation is a danger for the Russian economy. Since 1998 crisis, many of you remember it, Russia promoted a sound macroeconomic policy that finally resulted in the lowering inflation. Inflation is not anchored and volatile, dependent on external shocks, oil price, exchange rate, and domestic policy, for example, like military expenditures. And the most important is that the Central Bank of Russia has no instruments to keep inflation under control. Declining trend that we see from 2016 to 2018 was reversed, and since 2012, after the COVID, inflation started to grow. And the impact of the devaluation in the middle or in the beginning of 2022 and then in the end of 2022 and 2023 resulted in high inflation even further. So, and inflation is well above the central bank target, and we see the growing inflation that is going up. 12 months inflation is official one that is reported to the previous year, and 3 months is the current one. So we had take 3 months and annualized rate, and you see the difference. The most important is that central bank policy rate does not affect inflation. We know that policy change, rate change should affect inflation with a lag. Okay, we don't know, 6 months, 9 months, 12 months, or maybe 18 months. So for this picture, I took 6 months at least. And we see that central bank tried to react to the external shocks by hiking its interest rate, its key rate. And every time it was too late. Of course, you cannot react to the shock. Okay, the shock is with you, you react, but that means that due to the lag, it's too late. But what is more important, we see that central bank, after hiking its rate as a reaction to the external shock, keeps it too high. It happened in 2015-16, and it happened in 2023. But at the same time, central bank was late in increasing its rate with a high inflation. What we see here is the high inflation from 20 to 22 before the war, and central bank was keeping its rate very, very low. What is more important? It's the central bank rate decision does not affect appetite of economy for credit. You see, here we see the change of the interest rate, of the key rate of the central bank, and monthly increase in global credit. So credit by the banking sector to households and corporate sector. And we see that despite what's going on with the interest rate, is it hiking, the credit is stable, the rate is declining, the credit is declining. Rate is stable, credit is stable, rate is hiking, credit is hiking. So the economy is very strange, and to a great extent it depends on the government policy of subsidization of the interest rate that we saw in 2021 as a reaction to COVID and post-COVID recovery, and in 2022-2023 as a reaction to anti-contraction of the anti-sanction policy and subsidization of the mortgage rate. What is the real factor that influenced the inflation in Russia is the exchange rate. Here you see that the blue line is the price of the US dollar in the Russian foreign exchange market, currency market, and green and red line is inflation. It's not strange because 25 to 30% of the food and more than 60% of non-food retail sales is import. Central Bank estimates that the transfer of devaluation to CPI is equal no more than 10%, and independent experts agree with them, though it seems that the real lasting effect of devaluation is much, much longer. Until 2018, we could say that the exchange rate of the ruble was strongly dependent, correlated with the US dollar, with the oil price. But after the central bank and Minister of Finance modified their so-called budgetary rule, this link disappeared. And since then, this policy affecting foreign exchange is like a semiconductor. It resists ruble appreciation. So when oil price is going up, the central bank tries, and together with the Ministry of Finance, absorbing extra currency proceeds, they keep their exchange rate stable. While when the oil price falls, central bank allows ruble to devalue. So it's like step by step, ruble is going down, down, and down. What's in medium term? Budget. Also, medium term for me is any time while Putin is in power. It may be 3 years, it may be 5 years, or it may be 10 years. We don't know, maybe 15 years. Still, for me, for the purpose of this presentation, it's a medium term. And here we see much more challenges in the budget, in the output, and in inflation. Okay, inflation we discussed. So what's going with the budget? We see that in 22, 23, 24, the share of military expenditures, that is military, security, and general government expenditures, where government is hired in some expenditures for these purposes, increased from 30% to 45% of the overall budgetary expenditures. And as a result, all other expenditures except for pensions and interest payments, they were stable in nominal terms. And that means that in real terms, the budgetary expenditures were shrinking. And so we have a fork. We have a fork here for the challenge. If the war continues and if the war lasts in 25 and 26, so for the government it's a choice. Should the government keep the prudent budgetary balance, a budget deficit within 1 or 2% of GDP, but that means you have to cut real expenditures for the budgetary sector overall every year, and inflation is high, or you have to keep real expenditures at least stable. That means adjust them for inflation, but that means you have to forget about the small budget deficit and to allow it to increase. Okay, it's not a disaster, but let's say from 2% to 3.5% to 4%, maybe to 5% of GDP. After the war, the challenge is another one, because the military stimulus of the budget was significant. It was 1.5% in 22, 2.7% in 23, 4.2% of GDP in 24. So if the war ends, if the Ministry of Finance does not receive money to pay salaries, to require new weapons, that means the budgetary expenditures will shrink, and the output will shrink, and the tax revenues will shrink. So it's not a simple choice, but that means when the war stops, when the war ends, when military expenditures will expire, the Putin's economic policy will face a new challenge. And the second medium-term problem challenge for the Russian economy during Putin's time is technological dependence. Russia was never a producer of technology. It's imported technology all the time since the pre-revolution era, since the 19th century. And for example, in this year, in the 2024, in the first 3 months, we heard about the car producer, the single sole Russian car producer Lada. They have no airbags. Russian cell companies, they have no equipment for 5G. They have no access to 5G, and they have problems with equipment for 4G networks, because Huawei, the major Chinese producer, and the second-tier Chinese producers, they refuse to supply equipment to Russia, and that means third-tier equipment, and it's not stable, it's not communicated, it's not connected very well to the old equipment, so there are a lot of problems. The newly designed passenger plane MS-21 lacks engine because it relied on Rolls-Royce engines and crucial imported components. Russian government decided to invest everything by themselves, so import substitution, but as a result the plane became much more heavier, and its launch is postponed at least for 3 years, and nobody knows when it will fly and how efficient it will be. In the recent months, in the recent weeks, Ukrainian drones destroyed several oil refineries in the European part of Russia, and Russian companies, they could not find equipment because all Russian refineries, they are dependent either on Swedish or American equipment. And okay, that means they disappeared, and that's technological dependence. Russia had very ambitious plans to increase the LNG, but after the biggest Russian producer of the LNG, Novatek, was put in the sanction list, South Koreans stopped, cancelled all contracts to produce ice-breaking LNG tankers for Novatek, and there is a problem. Even if the LNG is produced, the problem is how to export it because there are no tankers, there are no free tankers. Long term after Putin, what happens? So Putin's economic policy and the economic policy of the central bank, of the Minister of Finance, is to kick the can down the road. But you know that sooner or later you have to pay for this policy, and the major problem will be to restore convertibility of the ruble, because the central bank imposed enormous amount of capital regulation and even current regulation. And as well, I see the major problem for the future Russia for the long term is legal challenges. About 1,000 companies left Russia and expelled Russia, and they were forced to sell their business, and with from 50 to 99% discount, the IP rights holders lost protection because Russian courts declared that Russian government may decide whose patent can be nullified in Russia, and the government established a special commission for these purposes. Many businesses were nationalized from Russian businessmen. So I assume that as soon as Putin regime will fall down, an enormous amount of legal challenges, legal complaints will go to the courts, and the Russian government will spend a lot of time trying to solve this problem. And until those problems, at least major problems, are solved, so foreign investors will not come to Russia. So those are challenges for Putin economic policy, and here we are. Thank you so much.